It's interesting to watch the Stefan Molyneux Poland video. You could say it's all an act. You could say it's all orchestrated. You can say that he's just playing a character in the same way that Alex Jones has argued. He's just playing a character in court, and maybe he's not playing a character. Maybe he just made that argument for the case of the divorce proceedings and custody of his children. But in any case, regardless, we at least have the inkling or the suspicion that media personalities, e-celebs, are just as fake, or to a degree fake, in the same way that mainstream figures play a character. Actors play character, politicians play character, actors often become politicians for that reason. Ronald Reagan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and even Trump. Having a reality TV show, it's reality TV, so it's all real. No, it's not real. There's always an element of fakeness to it. So the connection, the TV to politician pipeline has been going on at least since the Nixon-Kennedy debate. And, the internet hasn't really changed that dynamic altogether. What it's done is it's decentralized the means of production of, the acting. You can now be your own manager and your own publisher and your own producer and your own cinematographer, your own editor, your own proofreader, right? You can be a one-man band, a one-man show, and a lot of people do that at first, and then they get more popular and they hire assistants to do the little dirty, minuscule, tedious work for them so they can focus on what they're good at, which is primarily acting, scripting, coming up with what to say and how to say it in an effective way that creates a persona. People buy into this on an ideological level and a personal level. So it's not just this person is an ideologue teaching you something, but they're your friend, they're your mentor. Mentorship is very powerful. And it's interesting, having said all this, whether or not we think Stefan Molyneux is a character played by a man, or whether he's really genuine, or whether the truth is somewhere in between, it doesn't really matter. At least the character he's playing, there's a phrase, art is the lie that tells the truth, or sometimes more specifically, theater is the lie that tells the truth. And so even if he is playing a character, he is kind of describing or displaying a narrative or describing a narrative about how humans work. See, the person, whether real or imagined, the person of Stefan Molyneux was a libertarian. He was this ANCAP. He was this objectivist. He wrote a book on universally preferable behavior and objective morality and all this stuff. And you look at him, and he was all about logic, right? And I remember there was actually a video very, very long ago, and it was one of the first videos where I started thinking about critiquing someone, putting forth my 2 cents. And it was a Stefan Molyneux video where he says something like, nothing is holy, nothing is sacred, nothing is beyond criticism. The only things that really matter are truth and non-aggression and liberty. And I was like, okay, so how do you get from A to B? How do you get from this kind of Socratic nihilism where you're like, everything can be deconstructed, and then you're going from that to, and the truth is the only thing that mattered. So at least in what he was presenting, he was saying, I only care about empiricism. I only care about what I can see and what is the best system objectively, without caring about my own personal preferences. What are the universal preferences? And so this universalism and this logic that he was wedded to in his persona, he had gained a following. And even if he changed his mind, he couldn't really change his messaging because he would risk alienating his following. And at this point, I think he feels that he's successfully transitioned, which is an interesting word. It's like the transition from a man to a woman. The in-between stages are always a little bit strange. You have something that looks something like a woman, but now it has armpit hair, and then once you reach the male stage, then you sort of, hopefully you've breached the uncanny valley, right? That's the dream, that's the aspiration of transgender people. So Stefan Molyneux, it's not clear whether he's fully made the transition or he's still in transition, but it's interesting the remarks that he makes, how he talks about this feeling of collectivism, this feeling of belonging, and that dialectic, or the opposition between logos and pathos, is very clear in the monologues he presents. So you have on the one hand the logos, which is like free market capitalism, open borders, open trade. It's just basically saying, look, race doesn't matter, we're all individuals. This is stuff that's been put out since the 1940s, this Boasian anthropology of there are geniuses in every race, there are idiots in every race, there are athletes in every race, there are disabled people in every race, there are moral people in every race, there are criminals in every race. So you state that, and then you step back and you say, but individuals are different, and so what we're going to have is a meritocracy that allows all the geniuses, whether black, white, Asian, whatever, they're going to all rise to the top and rule society and make the decisions, and then the people at the bottom are going, whether they're black, white, Asian, or whatever, they're going to be disempowered, and it's going to be through a natural, organic meritocracy of capitalism. And in order to achieve that, we need to break down these artificial barriers that separate races and nations and peoples. We need to develop a universal law. That's what the United Nations has basically set out to do. On a continental scale, that's what the European Union sets out to do. So you have these breaking of boundaries because those boundaries stand in the way of meritocracy. And that's true. That in-group preference and nepotism, because, desiring a nation, desiring a race, that is a form of nepotism. That is a form of in-group preference. And it does prevent a pure meritocracy. If all you cared about is meritocracy, then yes, nationalism, racism, bigotry, these things do inhibit meritocracy. But if you totally eliminate these things, nationalism, bigotry, in-group, religious boundaries, if you eliminate all these things, then what are you left with for which to apply your merit? What use is merit? What use is intelligence? What use is athletic ability? What use is social ability? What use is emotional intelligence? What use are these traits, these merits, in making money? Well, what's the point of making money? What do we use that money for? Just pleasuring ourselves and hedonism? I think hedonism is an instinct that we have. We have an instinct. We desire sex. We desire food. We desire aesthetics, beautiful surroundings. Some people that manifests as, Donald Trump buying a gold-plated room. Other people, they like Art Deco. Some people, they're really into the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Some people like neoclassical or Baroque styles. So everyone has their preferences, and you can spend a lot of money on architecture and mansions and sex and food and all of these different things. Education can be expensive. Philanthropy, I guess that makes people feel good, doing good things for other people, helping the poor. So there's a lot of things to spend your money on. But let's kind of look then at nationalism through the lens of hedonism. Because if for instance, sex is drive, we want to have sex with people. Okay, so, and that gives us some kind of pleasure. But it's not just about being hooked up to an eternal jack-off machine. And it's not just about, especially when you're talking about wealthy people, they're not just looking at pictures of beautiful women. It's the idea of conquering a beautiful woman. Or you look at the case of Harvey Weinstein. A lot of these powerful men in the Me Too movement, what were they really interested in? They weren't actually interested in masturbating to beautiful women, because you can go online and do that for free. It was all about exercising power, exercising dominance, relational dominance. So saying, I'm a powerful man and therefore I am able to do this. And the fact that I'm able to do it and get away with it signifies my dominance, proves my dominance to myself. And so you could say there's possibly a self-esteem issue there. Self-esteem can at times act like a bottomless pit where no matter how confident and arrogant you theoretically are, you might still need this affirmation. In the same way that you look at the life story of Charles Dickens, he was a man who became very wealthy, and yet he always needed more money. He was always working on a book, neglecting his family, neglecting his children in order to pump out more books to get more money. So there's this insatiable need of these people, and that's perhaps what drives them to the top of these industries, is that they're such perfectionists, they're so driven, and it's insatiable, right? So you look at all these desires that people have, and then to me, nationalism itself becomes a commodity, right? From this total free market, neoconservative, globalist, neoliberal perspective, where the only thing that matters is getting as much money as possible so that you can satisfy your desires. It's like, oh, well, what about nationalism? Isn't nationalism a desire that people have? Like, people desire to be around others who are like themselves. People desire to be comfortable. People desire relational power. People desire to be part of something greater than themselves. And so you can look at nationalism through this lens that nationalism is a good in the same way that sex is a good. And not good as in good versus evil, but good as in a commodity that people desire. So people, men and women, both want to have sexual partners who are fit, who are high status. Physical appearance is important, and that's one aspect. But you have personality. You have oftentimes people will marry, especially women will marry men, not on the basis of their physical looks, but what's in their bank account and what is their social capital. So if a woman grows up in a conservative Christian household and she continues to follow that path, she's going to want to marry someone who has a good social status within the conservative Christian community. And he might not have that much money. He might not be super good looking. But if he has social capital within the conservative Christian community, then he becomes a fit partner. And so people grow up with a sense of in-group in the same way we grow up with a sense of sexual attraction to different kinds of women. Some men are into bigger women, some men are into slimmer women. Every man has a different preference, and so some men gravitate toward more a religious in-group. Some men gravitate more toward a in-group based on merit. But then what is merit? You know, are you obsessed with pro golfing or sports? Are you obsessed with chess champions? Are you obsessed with music? Are you obsessed with politics? What do you consider to be meritorious? What kind of abilities do you admire? And oftentimes, the abilities that you admire are the abilities that you yourself have a natural talent for. So someone who tends to be good at math is going to tend to admire mathematicians more than someone who is poor at math. And this admiration, there's a sort of superficial admiration, the kind of saintly admiration that we have for people like Einstein. So everyone venerates Einstein in the mainstream. But the people who are actually going to specifically venerate him, like in a deep way, like understanding who he was as a person and connecting with him and aspiring to be him in a real way, would be people who are, Israeli Zionists, and especially who are sort of on the political left, and people who are into that kind of relativistic physics and the metaphysics thereof, the consequential worldview that develops out of that kind of presumption of empirical truth. So I don't really know enough either way. I just sort of presume because, if I don't know enough to challenge the mainstream narrative, I just sort of assume the mainstream narrative. And that, again, is something that's a resultant of personality. There are some people who they have to reject everything. They have to be confrontational about everything. And they can only agree to something if it agrees with them, or if they can prove it themselves. And oftentimes their sense of power comes from, well, I reject the moon landing, and it gives them a sense of power to say, I reject your moon landing, and I have an alternative theory, and that makes me feel smarter than the people around me, and I can say, wake up, sheeple, and I can distinguish between myself and the sheeple. It's a very interesting inversion between anti-Semitism and the Semites that it potentially observes and describes and opposes. So an anti-Semite would say something like, Jews believe that goyim are animals. That's an anti-Semitic phrase, right? So at the same time that the anti-Semite says Jews believe that goyim are animals, and that's his perspective, he looks as a Jew and he says, this Jew looks at everyone who's not Jewish and he thinks, oh, that's an animal and we can just do whatever we want, we can rape them, kill them, whatever. And, so they can develop that theory and explain Zionism in that way, or explain open borders and globalism in that way, so they can do a political analysis that is consequential from this belief. But at the same time that the anti-Semite is saying that Jews believe that goyim are animals, which, again, I'm not assessing the truth value or the falsity of it, I'm just sort of stating it as a premise, that it is something anti-Semites tend to believe to one degree or another. So then you would have the anti-Semite himself. And the anti-Semite would view himself as an awakened individual, an enlightened individual, a red-pilled individual, distinct from his fellow man. And so he would describe the fellow man as an NPC or as sheeple. And so it's a very, very, very interesting inversion. And, we could ascribe a level of psychological projection to it, which is interesting, but you can also do the same thing with Jews, right? So when Jews describe Nazis, they say, well, these Nazis, the evil Nazis, they just want to kill everyone who's not German. Just want to kill everyone who's not German. Well, is that historically true? Again, if you might believe it, you might not believe it, I don't really care, but the perspective itself is interesting because, you look at the Hebrew Bible and it basically says, if you have power, you have license to kill the Amalekites and the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and the Jebusites and the Philistines, and the list goes on and on and on. So isn't that in some sense projection? When the Jew looks at the Nazi, he fears in the Nazi his own worst malice. And when the anti-Semite looks at the Jew, he fears his own worst arrogance. Those are two perspectives, and you could say they're contradictory. But I think when people are, and this has been observed since Wilhelm Marr, who's the one who came up, or at least popularized in part, the term anti-Semitism. It's often, the genealogy of the term is given to him as the father of anti-Semitism. That's not really true, but he is still a significant figure, and he basically made that case. It was at the end of the 19th century that he said these anti-Semites, they complain that the Jews have taken over publishing, but they're trying to do the same thing with Theodor Fritsch. He was trying to do a takeover of publishing in Germany and develop his own capitalistic methods. And he said, well, this is the same thing we accuse the Jews of. We're just trying to do a better job of being Jews than the Jews. So this is not something new that I'm saying. I'm not saying something original here, but it's interesting to point out. Really, the main point that I wanted to make in this video was that when we talk about, open borders and libertarianism and meritocracy in general, we have to ask to what end? And that was my problem with libertarianism, and I thought, liberty as a goal in itself, I had to ask to what end? To what end? And people would say happiness, hedonism, euphoria, well-being, quality of life. And I said, okay, well, what if someone defines their happiness as living in an ethno-state, or someone defines their happiness as racial purity, or you put this forth to a libertarian, and some would agree with you, and some would disagree. But the ones who would agree with you is, okay, well, what if someone defines happiness as I never have to make another choice in my life? My life is structured and regimented like a military platoon. and I feel that the state has my back and my race is secure and all these things. And so basically someone is saying that their happiness derives from authoritarianism. What does the libertarian say then? It's kind of, they're put in a hard position there where they're arguing essentially that people should be allowed to do whatever they want so long as it doesn't infringe upon the rights of others. But what if what makes a person happy is sadism? And what if they enjoy conquering others? For instance, a sports player, Tiger Woods, he probably enjoys winning golf tournaments, and winning those tournaments means making other people lose. So, if Tiger was just playing against his own record and just golfing alone, it might not be as exhilarating. It might not be as thrilling as him doing that against other opponents. Now, golf, there's nothing necessarily competitive about golf. You could play it all by yourself. You don't need other players there in order to show how good you are. But people do competitive golf because it shows their dominance over other people. So that's a basic human instinct. So we have basic human instincts like sex and dominance over others. And we have a desire for authoritarianism. We have a desire for in-group and familiarity and stability. And all of these things seem to clash with the idea that globalism is going to give us what we want. Libertarianism is going to give us what we want. Neoconservatism or neoliberalism, this is going to give us what we want. Because what if we want is really a world where we don't have to make choices anymore? Because choices are paralyzing. Choices give us anxiety. What if what we really want is paternalism? We want to know that the father of the nation is looking over us. What if we want is theocracy, where we don't have to constantly grapple with nihilism and depression, but we have a strong hand of the church looking over us? So you look at all these things, and of course Adorno was correct to say that fascism and the family are very well intertwined. But the question is, if the family is sort of an organic construction out of sexuality itself, then can you really destroy the family without, and can you destroy fascism, therefore, without fascism itself? Right? So if we define fascism as authoritarianism, if this authoritarianism emerges organically through sexual instincts or instincts for in-group, like what if people just have a natural predilection for this in-grouping process? So they in-group by religion, they in-group by race, they in-group by linguistic boundaries. So this is just a natural process. In order to stop people from in-grouping, you would need another kind of authoritarianism. You would need a leftist, egalitarian, meritocratic authoritarianism to come in and stamp out people's racism. And I believe it was Trotsky who used the term racism to refer to Ukrainians because they wanted to be independent from the Soviet Union. They wanted their own independent state, and he said they were racist for having these aspirations. And so we see many instances in the early Soviet Union and the modern world, and even the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other empires, where you essentially have an authoritarian power trying to stamp out people's sexuality, trying to stamp out people's desire for familiarity, for stability, for tradition, for homogeneity, for independence, for freedom. You see all these attempts. You see it on the right. You see it on the left. And on the right, there is a kind of coherence to an explicitly right-wing, explicitly authoritarian ideology, because the idea is like, hey, we want our own country, we want our own religion, we want our own people, and therefore we're not going to have open borders. We're not going to have total freedom of speech in an absolute sense, like we're not going to allow pornography. The ACLU can argue for pornography, and we're going to shut them down. So there are certain limits on what is permissible, what is allowed. We have certain white blood cells, or we have an immune system for our society that's going to protect us from perversions, from alterations that modify the fundamental tradition or the racial stock or the linguistic. France has its own committee on language that protects the purity of the French language. Which is really funny. Um, well, I mean, I think it's funny, but for maybe many French people take it seriously and they think it's something holy and sacred about their language. And I mean, I'm making fun of it, but there probably are people who think that French poetry is the most beautiful poetry in the world, and therefore it is a sacred and divine act to preserve the French language. I don't really share that view, but I'm sure some people actually do believe in it. So, that an authoritarian right-wing dictatorship, or whether it's a democracy, like Hungary is technically a democracy, but if it's a right-wing democracy, a populist democracy, there's a kind of internal coherence and consistency, whereas if a left-wing dictatorship comes to power and it says, we're going to use authoritarianism to stamp out fascism, then it's like, who's benefiting? And ultimately, people do benefit. Minoritarian groups benefit. So gays benefit, Jews benefit, blacks benefit. Anyone who would lose out in a populist scenario benefits from left-wing authoritarianism. And so that's why you see all these minority groups flocking to a left-wing authoritarianism, because they feel protected under a minoritarian rule. And that's always, the term intersectionality is popular today, but the concept dates back since the beginning, I guess, of socialism and the French Revolution, perhaps even farther back. I mean, Freemasonry wasn't just about Presbyterians, it wasn't just about Calvinists, it wasn't just about Anglicans or whatever. There were many different kinds of Freemasons, but they all saw common cause. And before that, you could talk about the alchemical tradition in Europe, alchemists, people who had these sort of metaphysical ideas, religious ideas, spiritual ideas, which were outside the explicit and exoteric Christian canon, and they were distinct and they were pre-Christian in many cases. And so, this stuff has been going on for a long time, that you've had people who have conceived of themselves, and I guess that whole point about the anti-Semite viewing the normie, the NPC, the blue-pilled person, as an animal or as a sheeple, versus the Jew who views the goyim as an animal. That view is not unique to Jews. It's not unique to anti-Semites. It's something that was popular among the European aristocracy. I mean, the European aristocracy really do view themselves as a distinct race from other Europeans. I mean, if you asked a European aristocrat, should you mix your blood with the common people, they say, no, we're of a completely different type. That would be disgusting. That would be like bestiality. And that view has continued to this day, and I think that's probably why they get along so well with Jews in many cases. And it's also the reason why they've had great conflict with Jews. So, I mean, you see in some cases Disraeli was able to buy into the aristocracy in England, in many other cases. But then you see in Germany, huge feuding between the German aristocracy and the Jewish people. So, in one case, this master race ideology of the European aristocracy and of the Jewish people was able to be syncretized in England. In Germany, it split off and speciated and gave rise to conflict. Did it necessarily have to be that way? No, it was dependent on a lot of contextual factors that were specific to those countries. But basically, this view of I am distinct from other people, that is the in-grouping instinct, the desire to say we have an us and we have a them. Globalism tries to break that down, but it relies upon left-wing authoritarianism to do so. Left-wing authoritarianism always relies on minoritarianism. So you look at the Soviet Union, and especially the early Soviet Union, people want to point out Jewish overrepresentation, but Jewish overrepresentation happens everywhere at all times in all things. Ever since Napoleon issued his Emancipation Proclamation, you've had, which is funny to put it like that, but you've had all kinds of Jewish overrepresentation for pro-monarchist advisors and anti-monarchists and whatever. So what the broader picture that I want to point to here is that look at the overrepresentation of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, people who are not of Russian stock. Look at the overrepresentation of Georgians. I mean, Stalin was a Georgian. So all these minority groups in Russia, they flocked to communism, whereas the majority of the Russian people were anti-communist. And so again, you see left-wing authoritarianism attracts minority groups, and that's always been the case. It always will be the case. Left or minoritarian groups will always propose logic and reason and merit as the things which should be the highest, and they'll say we should never devolve into populism. And it's an interesting case, because then if we look at the European people as being a people who have always valued truth and merit and empiricism, and they invented science and all these things, if that's the case, then what does that say about the European people? That they have a minoritarian mindset. Now you could say that comes from the relative isolation of tribal groups within Northern Europe. You could say it comes from the Indo-European cultural tradition, because the Indo-Europeans were a warrior people who went out and they conquered other peoples. And in that process of conquest, they recognized themselves as a minority elite, and they tried to preserve themselves in a caste system. In some cases, they were somewhat successful, in other cases less successful. But in either way, you look at India, the Brahmin view themselves as basically a distinct race of people. And so in the rest of Europe, where the Indo-Europeans also invaded, or they migrate, there's different ideas of how they got to Ireland, for example, or the Celts originate from the Alpine region. How did they get there? Did they invade? Did they just sort of intermarry? What happened exactly? But there is a minoritarian mindset to the Indo-European mythos and ethos, the outlook, the Weltanschauung. And that's perhaps the root of Western science, or maybe it goes deeper. I mean, you can go to the Egyptians, the Minoans, the Atlanteans, if you like. I don't really... Personally, I haven't seen the evidence that there was like some super race of people who lived in the Canary Islands. I just haven't seen that. So I follow the like mainstream anthropology insofar as human migration out of Africa. But I don't know. I'd be at least entertained by the evidence. I'm not afraid of the evidence if there is any. But in any case, the science as we know it today and logic seems to me to be tied to minoritarianism. Populism itself, or in-groupism as a desire, is related to the sexual desire. It's precognitive, it's instinctual. And so the more we become nationalistic, the less we become logical. And these two are sort of always in tension. Now you can find people, oh, this person was a Nazi, but they were also a very good scientist. Werner von Braun was a Nazi, he was in the SS, but he was also a really good scientist. And so how dare you say that nationalism is contradictory with science? And this is sort of the old dichotomy that people put between religion and science. And say, well, okay, look at this religious person who is so good at science. How can you tell me that the two are incompatible? And I'm not saying that the two are incompatible anymore, that I'm saying that a person can both be lustful and the person at the same time can desire sexual purity. So they can have both aspects of that, the human nature within one body. So people can be contradictory. So that itself, I think, is part of our nature. And I think that, when we talk about someone who has a high IQ, we're not talking about a different kind of person. People with high IQs still have animal instincts. See, no matter how intelligent you are, that doesn't mean you're going to have a small sex drive. Now, the Greeks would depict statues of ideal men with small phalluses because they wanted to illustrate a sort of morphological distinction between the priapic man, like Priapus, the man who is solely concentrated in his animal instincts, and then the higher man who is divorced from his animal instincts, who is of a higher quality, he's of a divine quality. And so they made this distinction, which I think is really based in biology, although they didn't necessarily understand the structure of the brain. We still don't fully understand the structure of the brain, but I don't think they understood the idea that perhaps humans had evolved out of animals. Now, maybe there were some more esoteric cults of schools of reincarnation that may have had an inkling of an idea of like a great chain of being where animals ascend to become humans or something like that. But the structure of the brain being what it is, where you have a very old ancestral parts where our most basic instincts come from, and then it sort of develops forward into the frontal cranium, and that's where we get our most logical and conscious thoughts. So, the Greeks didn't necessarily understand that explicitly, but sort of through trial and error and through intuition and through basically maybe folk wisdom is the best way to describe the process by which that they started to understand, like they understood the concept of heredity without understanding the concept of genetics. So in the same way they understood that there is a distinction between logos and pathos without understanding, okay, there's a distinction between, the frontal cranium and the lower cranium, the anterior, the posterior, whatever. So they understood these concepts and they tried to portray that in their artwork. But still, you can have men who are extremely intelligent, who are extremely logical at times, but then at other times they're still extremely lustful. They're extremely irrational in other ways. So simply to say that, because someone's very intelligent, they can't be irrational, it's just not the case. Intelligent people sometimes can be the most irrational people. Intelligent people can just go crazy. I mean, you can have someone who's extremely good at doing mathematics, and then they're just so irrational. They waste their time, they waste their life, and they drive themselves into misery, even though they're very good at solving math problems. Or poets who are very good at manipulating language, producing poems that deeply affect people on an emotional level. They understand the system of pathos on an intuitive level that far surpasses the normal intuition of people surrounding them. And they can be crazy people and live crazy lives and miserable, depressed lives. So being intelligent doesn't mean you're going to order your life in a way that necessarily makes sense. So I think these things, we can still draw distinctions between these things. And then we can also look at the necessity of both. I mean, our consciousness evolved from our pathos. Our logos evolved from our pathos in the sense that we developed consciousness because of an animal will to survive. It's not that consciousness created the animal. I mean, that's sort of the deistic or theistic argument that basically you had God, and God was pure logos, and logos created man and animals and plants and everything. So logos brought the will into the world, logos brought desire into the world, logos brought pathos into the world. But from my perspective, the first act of God, the first godness of God, is that God wants to bring something into the world. Without this godly desire, if God has no will, then God is nothing. If God does not want something to be, then nothing is, and therefore there's no godness of God to even talk about. God only becomes a subject which we can refer to once God has a will. And so from my perspective, it is the will that is primary, and the logos that is sort of a product of the will, that this basic will desires, metalogical laws to come into existence in some way, if we can even talk about their existence, and then they're in existence, and then we can refer to them in interacting with the will. So to the extent that we're able to understand logos is the extent to which we're able to understand the mind of God, and then which is really the will of God. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff going on here, but basically it's the idea that you can't just be logical. At some point you have to understand that logic is a product of the will, and so you have to have both. You have to understand your will, and you have to understand, of course, logical questions of empiricism and mathematics. If you just completely understand, if you don't tap into logic at all, then you're just an animal. And logic is very good at crushing animals and dominating them and killing them and domesticating them and enslaving them and putting them into factory farms. So if you don't want to be an NPC, you don't want to be a factory farm animal, you do have to harness logos to a great extent. You have to be a master of logos. But to be pure about your logos, and to have no desire, to have no will, to want nothing, also puts you in the position of, being basically a very smart antinatalist, a very smart person who's suicidal, a very smart person who's depressed, who's passive, who's afraid, who's anxious, right? So to break out of that, a miserable existence, you have to engage with the will. And I really enjoy this commenter. He's my favorite commenter, Maldoror, this antinatalist, because he just so clearly states the reality as it is. He just calls it evil. And I say, well, no, we have to accept reality as it is, and we have to somehow reconcile ourselves to it. He says, no, this is how reality is, and we have to oppose it, which I think is just an element of his personality. But I appreciate the fact that he has a different perspective, because he does really get to the heart of things, and he just tells it like it is, and I appreciate that. But I think that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.